This week we're going to be making a beautiful, whimsical, overgrown building built to be a part of nature itself. This is very much inspired by The Hobbit, as well as these buildings here from printable scenery. This is what my DM showed me when he wanted something to be built for the hometown of my original character Hugh over at Tomes and Tales. So I took this and I went absolutely nuts with it, because if I'm making something to go into my own character's backstory, I really want it to represent what I had in mind when I wrote him up. I'll warn you now, this is a fairly long video for one of my builds because it is an incredibly detailed end result. And since it was such a big build, I really went out of my way to make it multi-sided so that we could show either facade of the building to get a replayability from this piece. So if you want to build something like this yourself, you'll have multiple ways you can place it down on the table to get use in game, or if it's just a display piece for you, no matter which way someone looks at it, they're going to find something beautiful and interesting to look at. So let's jump into the build and see where it goes.
I'm going to start by cutting out a oddly shaped piece of MDF board. I don't want this to be a perfect circle or square, as I want it to fit down on a board and really give us the edges of this building. So I just cut it up till I find a shape I'm happy with, and then start running my blade around the edges, cutting off these edge pieces to remove the lip.
Kind of tapering this down on the sides. You don't have to do this, but I like to try and blend my edges so when they're sitting down on a map, we don't have a little flat bit around the side of every building sticking up. Personal choice, just something aesthetic that I personally like to do. Now we have the sides tapered down, our base is ready to start planning out our full building. So to build out the main shape of our building, we're going to be using some XPS foam or insulation foam. You can get this in a whole heap of different varieties, but you really want to try and find one that can take patterns and carving well. When you have something like this, it really does the trick. So we need to start cutting this down to size, because as you can see, this is a bit large and unwieldy and it's going to be just not fun to work with. You could just use a Stanley knife, but I'm going to be using some cheap hot wire cutters that I picked up on Amazon. Now ideally I'd be using a proper hot wire cutter with a jig and everything, but this is what I've got.
So we heat it up and just start running that through our foam, and it cuts like a hot knife through butter.
Not bad. Could have been a straighter cut, but that'll work for what we need.
This thing is so satisfying to use. It just pushes its way straight through the foam, but admittedly not always the straightest cut.
That was definitely not straight, but that's fine.
Once we have a few pieces chopped down, we just start laying them out to build out our building, continuing to cut more pieces down as we don't need these the full thickness the whole way around. I'm keeping the flat sides out as I want to carve patterns into these later on, so I want them to be as easy to carve into as possible. But essentially what I'm doing here is trying to build out the rough shape that I imagine the bottom story of our building will look like. Once I'm happy, I glue them all in place and start chopping down some elements to give us more of a natural hill shape. And then start building out our second floor. For this, I'm essentially just going to put in a few skewers to hold up another piece of foam and build out a floor, just so that we don't have to fill the entire thing in with foam, saving us some material. There's a lot of shaping here, just building out this sort of rough hill shape that I'm wanting to go with, and obviously depending on your build, you could do this sort of any way you want. This part of the build just requires a lot of imagination. I'm then putting in a few more flat-fronted faces so we can build out a second floor where I plan to add a few more details and carved walls. Now I'm going to fill in a whole heap of gaps with scrap pieces of foam just so we don't have to waste as much foam later on, but I am coming at this entire thing with a rough concept of what I actually want the final building to look like.
So for this we're going to have a front door, a back door, a side shop, and the rest of this is going to be a hill. Maybe a balcony and some stairs? Could go. Let's see. We now have our random shape, but I want to build it out more natural. So for this, we're going to be using some expanding foam. Essentially, this stuff is just gonna coat a lot of these areas that I want to look more natural. We'll let it expand out and fill in all the gaps. Then we'll cut that down to fill in our size.
This stuff is a lot of fun, but be careful because it can expand a lot more than you would expect. So start with the sort of bare minimum, understanding that it's probably going to almost double in size by the time it has finished. When it has set, it will be like a regular foam, really giving the ability to cut into it and shave it back as much as you like, but having a nice, random, natural looking feel.
So now we have this totally covered, we give it a little bit more time to expand out a little bit more and dry off. Once that's done, we can carve it back and start building out our Hobbit holes.
While looking at this, I decided I wanted to add a few more elements that I could add some more building textures and details into. So I grabbed a couple more blocks of XPS foam and stuck them in, using the expanding foam to try and kind of hold them in place. These did need some more stability, but I'll get to that soon, because I also decided right now that I wanted to add in a whole heap of rock molds. So I grabbed out my Woodland Scenics rock molds, mixed up some plaster of Paris with some grey grout for colouring, and made myself some rock pieces. You can also do this same technique just with crinkled up foil if you don't have pre-existing rock molds. They look pretty good that way, but I've got the rock mold, so why not take advantage? I had a whole heap of these pre-prepared, so I didn't have to wait for them to dry, and I just started grabbing out the pieces I liked and sticking them in over my build. I probably should have waited for the foam to dry, as these things were heavy and did start to fall out later on, kind of misshaping some of my bits and pieces. So I grabbed out some skewers and made some makeshift scaffolding with some hot glue to hold them in place and wait for everything to dry.
So this has had a night to dry. Some of it expanded a little bit more than I was ready for. I should have known better because I have worked with this stuff in the past. And we've had to kind of build a few little stabilizing pieces, if we move this around, to stop everything from collapsing. As these bits here, which I can now pull away, were kind of just holding this stuff from falling over. But ultimately, we now have a really good base to start carving away and planning out what we want from our build.
Firstly, I'm going to grab my Stanley knife and clean up any of these bottom areas where the foam has expanded down past our base, just to make sure everything balances nicely.
So the plan of attack here will be a back door with a balcony and a little area to come out on the top here. Then on the front we have our main entrance, a little bit of a window spot, and a kind of extra little lookout section over to the side here. I also want to have a little hidden secret door on the side here, but this expanding foam has kind of overtaken a little bit more than I would have liked. So we're going to start carving this back and kind of pulling out the shape that we want the overall building to be.
Essentially, I'm just grabbing a Stanley knife here and going to town on my foam, bringing it back to the base level that I want to build from. You could just leave it as is and really have that naturally formed random effect, but I know certain areas that I want to flatten out to be more playable or add some staircases, so I'm carving in the shapes that I want. You could also do this with just a regular kitchen knife, and as always, be careful when using knives. I may go a little bit wild with these, but after all of my practice, I have a fairly good hand-eye coordination and control of these blades. That's not to say that I don't slip up from time to time, so be better than me. But after all that, I'm left with a really good base.
So I've managed to make a significant mess, but we have a much less unwieldy base for our building. The next part of the plan will be to come in and add a whole heap more details onto all of this XPS foam to start bringing the building to life before we coat all of the expanding foam sections with Sculptomold to give it a more earthen look to make it feel like this is really carved into the side of a rocky hill. Here's the truth. I'm actually going to cheat this just a little bit. Rather than carving out every single window and door that I want to place on this build, I'm going to be using these molds that I made last week. So I made the design once, I made a silicone rubber mold, and I've cast a collection of windows and doors that I can use for these kinds of builds. As I'm planning to do a whole collection, I really want them to match the same aesthetic, and I don't have the time to carve every single piece. This isn't completely necessary, you could carve them all out yourself as you're going, but for someone like me that's going to be making a big collection of these and I want them to all have the same aesthetic, having all of these bits and pieces that I can mass produce and reuse is going to be super handy and a massive time saver. It also gives me the ability to reuse these in the future when I'm trying to throw something together really quick for a game and I don't have the time to carve out all of these individual details. If you want to check out the video last week where I really show the process of making these, molding them and casting them, the link will be in the description and I'll throw it up here somewhere as well. Otherwise, like I said, you could carve these all out individually or you could just 3D print them if you find some elements online and you have access to a 3D printer. So let's start adding them onto this build and seeing what we can puzzle together.
Now in this particular case, all of these pieces were designed and built for this particular construction, so they should fit quite nicely. First off, we're going to make this side popping out window lookout piece. So we're going to cut these back to match the perfect size of our casts and start gluing these window pieces in place. Anywhere that there is some leftover foam, I could carve in detail, but in this case I'm going to come in with a heap of coffee stir sticks and toothpicks and pieces of wood that I've collected over time and fill in all of our gaps, giving us even more details. The level I'm going to here is probably not completely necessary, but when you have that final build that is full of details, it gives you the ability to look at it over and over again and keep finding something new. Now we're going to do the front door. For this, I'll be using a couple of the molds that I made last week and gluing them in place with just a little bit of hot glue. Then tracing out the rock wall pattern that I want around the door before pulling that off and then tracing over the drawing with a hot end to carve out our brick pattern. This hot end is an attachment for the hot wire cutter that I used earlier, but you can do this in a few different ways that I will show shortly. Once I have my basic pattern drawn out, I'm going to texture everything up with a rolled up piece of aluminium foil to give us a nice rocky texture. Then gluing that door back in place. Now I want a little pathway along the front, so I'm grabbing out a little piece of foam board and carving out a similar style rock pattern. This is really just me eyeballing it, having a go at a few different designs, then texturing it up to match. Now it's time to add in my rock window design. This time tracing around it and carving that hole a little bit deeper into the foam so I can inset that rock into our wall, and then just eyeballing another rock pattern with the hot end. Before gluing this one down, I decided to add a little bit of granny grading like I did for my other original windows, so we chop out a little piece and glue that in behind. Now for the other side of the building, I decided to use a bit more of a traditional style door so we could flip this building around and have two different styles that we could use for different games. Similarly to before, I drew out our rock pattern, this time cutting it in with a scalpel and then digging in deeper with the pen, rather than burning it in. This is a much easier approach for those of you that don't have a hot end or hot wire cutter to really carve in those shapes. Honestly, I actually think this looks better. It also got the basic texturing before the door was glued in place. Now I just continue around the different edges of the building, adding in doors, windows and other details as I see fit. Carving up extra bits of balsa wood and stir sticks to add in details and blend everything together nicely. Then grabbing a black paint and Mod Podge mix and sealing up all of our foam. This will help protect against different materials and give it a nice base coat. While I was here, I decided to carve out a few extra pieces and add in some bases for a balcony. My decision here was to make the balcony removable so I could get in and out later on for painting. So I built in these few base pieces carved into the foam and started sizing up our baseboards. Then chopping them down and building out a nice staggered wooden balcony. At this point I decided I needed a chimney, as all of these older places would have a fireplace. So I grabbed out a rectangular piece of foam and carved out a hole for it, quickly deciding that I didn't like where I put it and that I wanted it somewhere else. So I just changed my mind and carved a new hole. I wanted to pattern this up with a nice brick pattern, so I carved it in with a scalpel, then pressed it in deeper with a pen. Once I had the first row done, I textured this up with that aluminium foil from earlier, and then came up with a staggered brick pattern that I wanted through my entire build. Again, carving that in with our blade and deepening all of our cuts with a pen, leaving us with a really nice staggered brick chimney. That gets dry fitted in place and sealed up with that black paint and Mod Podge mix, probably a little bit too watery this time. Now it's time for some texturing. For this, I'm going to be using a homemade Sculptomold. Essentially, we're going to be grabbing the Sculptomold base, which I built in an old video that I will link here, adding in some PVA glue, some water, and a little bit of paint just to give us a nice base. This needs a little bit of extra mix till we get a nice texture, and then we just start smearing this all over our build, filling in any gaps where the foam's poking through and helping to conjoin rocks and different elements to give it a really nice natural feel. I like getting in there with this stuff with my fingers. It's messy, but it is a lot of fun. And by the time you're done, it really does add a really nice next level to a build, giving you a really natural, random, earthy texture. As you go, you can flatten it out by adding a little bit more water to your fingers and get a really nice smooth edge for any areas that you want to be playable and a little bit smoother.
Okay, so that's had a chance to sort of half dry. I should probably let it fully dry, but I want to get in and give all of these rocks a paint before I go to bed so it can all dry overnight. The method that I'm going to use for this is leopard spotting. I have done it in the past, but I'll show you through the whole process again here today. Essentially, all you're going to need is water and a heap of cheap acrylic paints.
Grab out a few mixing cups, add some water and a few dollops of your paint colors of choice. Now, if you like, you can add in a little bit of matte medium, not necessary, but I like to add it in, and then we just start stirring these up and getting them really well mixed. Once you have a nice selection of really watered down paints, you grab out your build and just start splotching them all over randomly. I like to start with the brightest colors and slowly work them down, and you should probably do it a little bit more sparingly than I did. Mine came out a little bit brighter ultimately than you probably want, but it's not so bad. As I work my way up through the darker colors, I slowly cover more and more of our rocks, allowing the colors to blend together and take over one another in different sections. This ends up leaving you with a really nice, natural, random, earthy rock. Obviously, different colors can give you different results. Blues and grays are a nice combination, but in this case, I wanted a really warm rock.
Now that's had a nice heavy coat, really soaking into all of those plaster rock molds. I've also gone right in through all of that extra Sculptomold to just sort of blend even more of it together and try and let these random earthy colors mix throughout the whole build. I'm going to leave this overnight to dry, and in the morning we'll come back and hopefully have a nice base. Then it's time to start painting up the rest of these elements and maybe finally building out this back wall, but I'll need to build a new door for that, as what I made previously is a little bit too big for this section. So for now, we'll let this dry tonight and probably come back at this tomorrow and fix up any little bits and pieces before getting on to the next stage of the build.
The following day.
That's all dried up really nice, but we have this one last back wall that needs detailing. So I'm going to start adding in some more bits and pieces for that with the molded windows from last week and some coffee stir sticks, then grabbing out a piece of foam and measuring it to size to build a brand new custom door that will fit perfectly into this spot. Essentially just taking a tiny bit of foam, carving out a pattern, digging it in deeper with a pen to give us a bit more definition, adding some wood textures with a wire brush, and then a couple of cross beams to make it a little bit different to the rest of our doors. I added a little glass bead as a handle and glued that in place, then adding on a few more little wooden details to add in a little bit of something extra to that wall. Finally, I grabbed out a watered down brown paint and just soaked this into all of that Sculptomold to give us a nice base earthy color, and left that to dry.
Okay, so we've got a nice base going for our overall build. I'm liking the colors that I got in the stones. They're a little bit brighter than I normally do, but hey, it's something a little bit different. So now I want to paint up all of our sections that were done with our resin pours. I'm going to need to prime these first, and I could do this individually with a hand-painted primer, but what I'm going to do is mask off all of our rock areas around the outside and hit them with some spray paint. If you were doing it by hand, you wouldn't need to worry about the masking, but since I want to do it with the spray paint,
we're going to grab out the masking tape and start applying it around all of our edges. I want to come in nice and tight along these edges so we can paint these up as nice as possible without ruining any of our leopard spotting. Once that's done, we'll take it outside and start blasting it all with a grey primer. This is why we sealed up all of our foam, but as you'll see in a minute, some of that didn't quite work. So yeah, I ruined that door. This is what happens when spray paint gets onto raw foam. But there's no point stopping now, so I grabbed out a brown spray paint and gave everything a fresh layer, including that melted area, which I just kind of tore out and came back in with a new door. I also gave all of my wooden pieces for the balcony a base with that same brown, then took everything outside and gave them a light spritz with a wooden deck tan. I like this colour because it stains up nicely. And the next stage of the paint is an Agrax Earthshade. I really came in heavy, just splotching this over all of my wooden areas. I love the result of these paints together, but obviously not everyone's going to want to spend as much money. So you could easily mix up your own shades, but I have plenty of the Agrax, so I'm going to be using it. Once that's dry, I came back in with a towel light ochre and dry brush on a whole heap of highlights. This is the same technique I use for painting wood in pretty much every build I do, and I really just love the end result, so I'll probably be doing this forever. Now for the stonework, I'm coming in and really just randomly blotching different colours over all of these different stones. Once they're washed and dry brushed, they'll come together nicely. I decided to go with a terracotta red for our chimney and pathway, and then dry brushed a little bit of grey on that doorway, before coming in and building out a few more wooden details around that top window. After all, there's always room for improvement. Now it's time to come in with a extra heavy dousing of that Sculptomold, this time mixing in a heap of brown paint to help us cover up any foam or other bits and pieces we've missed with a nice bit of dirt. Now it's time for some washes. A black wash goes over all of our stonework to just really help blend all those colours together, and we're going to coat all of our earth and rocks with another layer of brown wash. This should just soak into that Sculptomold and really give you a natural blending of all the colours and pieces we've made so far. While I was doing that, I decided I wanted to add in some stone stairs. So I cut out some pieces of foam, chopped them back and made them nice and random and gave them some stone texturing, then painted them up with that black paint and Mod Podge mix to seal the outer layer and glued them down where I thought some steps would naturally fit, adding in a few support stones as I went and painting them grey. I didn't like them just floating there, so I grabbed a few more little pieces of stone and pressed these in underneath to support each of the stairs and painted these up accordingly. Then mixed up a little bit more Sculptomold to fill in any of the gaps and really seal these in place. I loved how these looked, so I continued them all the way up to the top of the roof, giving us a full pathway to follow from the balcony up to the roof. Now I'm going to grab out some metallic paints and hit all of those details on our doorways. The next step is making a render for that top wall. So I grab out some white gesso and mix in a little bit of pigment powder to give it a bit of extra texture before adding in a few dollops of paint to give it a little bit more colour. Then scooping this up and just starting to add it over all of our walls. I really just slop that in there, trying to push it down into all the gaps. If it gets onto the wooden areas, I'm not too concerned. You can wipe it away and repaint this, and it really just does a good job of covering up any areas that you don't want to add a whole lot of bricks and extra texture to. As you can see here, I repainted some of those wooden bits as I kind of messed them up a little bit. But while that's all drying, I decided to build an extra step. I felt like we were missing one spot between that balcony and the stone stairway, so I thought why not throw a wooden stair in there. I just built this the same way, adding in a few extra supports and then staining it up. While I had the stain out, I decided to re-hit all of those wooden areas that I repainted around our rendered wall, giving them a nice dark tone, and then gluing in our doorway. And gluing in the last few details on our side entrance. Then comes the Tamiya soil effects. This is my favourite texture paste, and I'm basically just going to grab a chunk of this and start blotching it all over anywhere that I want to look like dirt. I water this stuff down and it soaks in nicely, On some of these hills, I did blotch it on a lot more to look a bit more muddy and came in to fill in any gaps with it as well. I use this stuff a lot and I love the texture when it's dried.
So we have a really nice base now with a whole heap of different dirt and rock textures, a nice amount of detail painted in, but now it's time to add all of our grass tufts and flockings to really help this come to life.
This is my favorite part of any build. I'm going to throw down a bit of baking paper to start and then grab out all of my grass tufts and turfs and static grasses and just start going nuts. I grab out a map Mod Podge and the static grass applicator for the main part of this process. Map Mod Podge is great because you won't get that shine underneath, but you could use PVA glue. Then I fill up my static grass applicator. This is just a cheapie that I bought on Amazon. There are better ones out there and you could just stick this on by hand, but you'll see in a minute why I use this. Because the glue is water-based, it runs an electric current through there and all of that grass sticks upright, looking beautiful. So I just keep making my way around my build, blotching on that Mod Podge and hitting it with layers of static grass wherever I feel like turf would have grown. In this particular build, I want it to be bright and absolutely covered in grasses. So I go to town with the static grass, then I come in with some flocking. This stuff is just smaller foam flocking, but fills in the gaps really nicely and gives us a good bit of variation so we don't just have one type of green. Throughout this build, I actually use a handful of different flockings, giving us different color variations and just slight changes to different areas on the build to make it look like this is natural and overgrown with all different kinds of mosses and grasses and just different things. A lot of this flocking and static grass will fall off as you're going. This is why I laid down that paper at the start so I can collect everything up. Do your best to keep these separate, but inevitably they will mix up, so I usually just keep these as a random mix for future builds. And there we have our first layer of static grass and flocking. Now it's starting to look colourful, but we want to add in even more variation with grass tufts and clump foliage and flowers. So we grab these out and just start gluing them in place wherever we think something would sprout. This is absolutely one of those sections you might not need yourself, but I absolutely love to do this and tend to go overboard. And I want this build to be beautiful, coloured and full of little details. And I'm going to absolutely cover this build in as many different colours and styles as I can fit without overdoing it. Actually, scratch that, I'm going to overdo it. I'm even going to test out a new way of adding extra flower. So I'm dappling on some glue over the edges of all this static grass and coming in with some bright coloured craft sands, sprinkling this on and letting it stick where the glue sits. This is allowing me to kind of connect up different flower beds and make it look like all of these grasses are growing extra flowers. And why not throw a couple more tufts in there for good measure? I grabbed out a little bit of polyester wadding, tore it down, and hot glued that into our chimney to give us a nice little bit of smoke billowing out. Then decided I wanted to add a lot more detail and a railing to our balcony. So I threw something together, painted it up to match, and glued that in place. Once again, you could easily call it done here, but I went to a model warehouse and got myself some more bits and pieces, so I'm going to add more details. I got these awesome vines from Modeler's Warehouse. I'll put their link in the description. Love these guys. You can buy them online and they'll deliver anywhere in the world. This stuff was a little bit hard to work with, but man, it's cool. So we stuck that all up the side, giving us a bit more overgrowth before going to my trusty 3D prints. All of these 3D printed little bits are available for free on Thingiverse. If you have a resin printer, I couldn't recommend these more highly. All of these little critters like the butterflies that I use in a lot of my builds add that last tiny little bit of extra detail for anyone that cares to look. And to finish it off, my favourite of these tiny bits, these little tiny frogs. And with that, I think I can finally call this build done.
And look at this thing. I am absolutely blown away by how beautiful this has come out, having multiple faces so we can play it in different circumstances. And like I mentioned earlier, there are so many details on this piece, so if you're just using this as a display piece, it's going to get attention. Since building this, it is already taken over as the most asked about and looked at piece in my studio by anyone who has come to visit. And personally, I see why. It is beautiful, it is colourful, and there are just little details everywhere, every way you look at it. I hope you've all enjoyed this episode and like what I've made here as much as I do. Having two facades, we've got a front and a back that can both be played out in different circumstances, just means that this thing not only looks incredible on my shelf, but has multiple playable faces. I'm stoked with this and I can't wait to work on the next stage, which will be a couple of more traditional Hobbit holes in the more Hobbit and Lord of the Rings built into the hillside style. And that will be in the next video of Seb Makes Stuff. If you've stuck around this long, you are either really loving this build or you're one of my true fans. So I'll let you know I have finally started a Patreon. I'm not asking any of you to go out of your way, but if you did want to support the channel, I'll have the link in the description. I love you all and I'm going to be making things no matter whether people support me or not. I'm just doing this because I love it and I really want to encourage others out there to make things of their own and maybe add us a little bit of magic and whimsical fantasy into their own lives. Eventually, I would love to add some more things to be able to give back to you guys on there, but we'll see how that goes in the future, as I am currently working on a D&D module with my friends over at Tomes and Tales RPG that will be available in an ebook eventually. I hope you found some inspiration or at least enjoyed watching me make this beautiful piece, and until next time, never stop making stuff.